Now, in closing, I want to say a few things about the legacies of this conflict. As the war was winding down and its end was clearly in sight, many expressed their hopes for what would come with a reconstructed union and with slavery ended. On Sunday, February 12, 1865, the Reverend Henry Highland Garnet, pastor of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C., became the first African-American minister to preach in the House of Representatives. And yes, in those days, preachers were actually invited from time to time to conduct services in the Congress. Garnet outlined his hopes for what lay ahead, and I quote at length a portion of his sermon. "The nation has begun its exodus from worse than Egyptian bondage, and I beseech you that you say to the people that they go forward. With the assurance of God's favor in all things done in obedience to his righteous will, and guided by day and by night by the pillars of cloud and fire, let us not pause until we have reached the other and safe side of the stormy and crimson sea. Let freemen and patriots mete out complete and equal justice to all men, and thus prove to mankind the superiority of our democratic republican government." A little later he said, "Then before us a path of prosperity will open, and upon us will descend the mercies and favors of God. Then shall the people of other countries who are standing tiptoe on the shores of every ocean, earnestly looking to see the end of this amazing conflict, behold a republic, behold a republic that is sufficiently strong to outlive the ruin and desolations of civil war, having the magnanimity to do justice to the poorest and weakest of her citizens. Thus we shall give the world the form of a model republic founded on the principles of justice, humanity, and Christianity." How well was Garnet's vision realized? Well, wartime views certainly continued to shape the attitudes of many. Some in the North, for example, continued to issue old battle cries, and in the South, there were some, like Robert Dabney, who nursed grudges against what he called perfidious Yankees and longed for a retributive providence that would yet obliterate the Union. But as the hatreds of war subsided, most partisans gradually and subtly transformed earlier convictions. Southerners often admitted that the preservation of the Union had ultimately been for the best, but they found ways to salvage honor and meaning from defeat through what has been called the cult of the lost cause, ritualized in Confederate Memorial Days, the erection of statues of fallen heroes, and in an outpouring of literature. They surrounded the defeated South with an aura of sentimental nobility, playing down the role that slavery had played in launching the conflict. Advocates of the lost cause converted Confederate warriors, especially Robert E. Lee and Presbyterian Stonewall Jackson, into men of exemplary piety who had reluctantly taken up arms to fight for the right as they understood it. In a haze of moonlight and magnolias that would reach its peak in Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind, the Confederate great were thus transformed into romantic heroes whose virtues might be appreciated even by former enemies. And the issue of slavery drops out of the picture almost altogether. Virtually all Northern clergy continued to assert the righteousness of the Union cause, but they wanted to bury the acrimony of the past. That would seem to be a good thing to do. But in the process, sadly, the deeper moral issues of the 1860s were often trivialized or obscured, and the price was paid. Let us never forget this for a minute. The reunion of North and South had a price, and it was paid by African Americans. Victor and vanquished soon tacitly agreed to end Reconstruction without securing the full rights guaranteed now by the Constitution to the former slaves. As the white North and the white South tentatively clasped hands, epidemic lynching, the gutting of civil rights legislation, the creation of Jim Crow laws took place. Now surely that was far short of the moral rebirth that one would hope would follow the baptism of blood. I want to mention two other issues for your reflection because they've come up recently in literature about the religion in the Civil War. One has to do with the question of just warfare. Harry Stout of Yale University has written a book on Upon the Altar of the Nation, in which he notes how practices that would have been deemed unjust in war came to be taken for granted during the Civil War and were scarcely questioned by anybody on either side, clergy as well as laity. Just think of the sheer cost of the war, in part because the two sides were fighting a modern war with old-fashioned tactics. The casualty rates were horrific. Now, one of the criteria for a just war has that the cost be proportionate to what's achieved. Did anybody stop to ask, Harry said, has noted, whether the cost being paid was proportionate? And the answer is no. Another classic criterion of the just war is that civilians are exempted. Now, civilians were not targeted in the sense that they were killed or bombed as they would be in later wars. In fact, by modern standards, the civilian casualty rate, though we don't really know it for sure, appears to have been fairly low. But civilians were targeted in other ways. Their food, their crops were burned. And the idea was that if you didn't, as Sherman put it before his march to the sea, he had to make all Georgia howl. In other words, people weren't going to give up rebellion unless people at home were suffering because of it. And that's quite deliberately what he was doing. That's what Sheridan was doing when he marched down the valley in Virginia in 1864. No one's asking questions. Are these legitimate tactics of war? And one final thing. It was raised recently in our issue by Mark Knoll, the Civil War. I assume most of you have seen the Civil War issue we sent out. He argues that the Civil War was, at the end of the day, a theological crisis. Because on both sides, one sees clergy running off to wave the flag for their respective sections with very little theological reflection upon why they are doing so. In a book he wrote a few years ago, he poses an intriguing question. When one looks, and I'm paraphrasing him, this isn't his exact quote, but when one looks at the average clerical utterance and sees its self-righteousness, its certainty that God was on the side that the minister favored, and then compares that to the modesty of Abraham Lincoln's pronouncement in his second inaugural address. How is it one explains that? Why is it that the professional theologians, as Noel puts it, rendered the shallow, superficial understanding of the war theologically, and the people who were trained in theology, the man who never was trained in theology, who didn't even profess formally to be a believer, never joined the church, though he attended New York Avenue Presbyterian while he was president, he gave the deeper, arguably more biblical understanding that protected the mystery of God's providence. I leave you with that.